Okay, now let's take a look at adding an important class in our project, the DbContext class. And inside the API, we'll create a new folder and we'll call it data. And inside this new data folder, we'll create a new file and we'll select the class and we'll call this DataContext and press return. Now, once again, the namespace as defaulted to API, and I'm going to change it to API.data. Now we need to derive from an entity framework class called DbContext. So I'm going to add a colon and specify DbContext. And the auto import functionality in VS Code is much improved compared to what it was a year or two ago. And we can select DbContext as a class that we want to import, and then this adds the using statement to the top of our file, because that's where the DbContext class is located in the entity framework core namespace. So when we want to use a class from a different namespace, we use using statements. Now we need to provide this class with some options. We need to tell it where to find our database and how to get to our database, because this class, if we take a look at its description, a DbContext instance represents a session between the database and can be used to query and save instances of our entities. And we've already got an entity called the app user. And the DbContext is a combination of the unit of work and repository patterns. And what this really tells us is that the repository pattern and unit of work patterns, these are viable patterns to use with C# development and can centralize our database access code. But this description is effectively telling us, hey, you don't need to use those patterns. You can just use the DbContext because this does that job. And even though that does do that job, we are still going to look at the units of work and repository pattern in this training course, because it does help to organize and centralize our data access code. And we'll come on to that a bit later, but we're not going to look at that right now. So now we have this DbContext, we need to give it the options. So let's put our cursor inside the data context and then use the quick fix. And the quick fix on my keyboard is command and period. But if you're not sure what it is, then just with your cursor in the data context, you've got this light bulb here, and this brings up the quick fix. But if you hover over the light bulb, then it tells you which the shortcut keys are to show the code actions. I call it quick fix because typically we'll see this when we've got an option to fix a coding mistake, but also you can get code actions from anywhere inside your class. And like I said, in my case, this is command and period. Please do double check what it is on your computer, because this is another important keyboard shortcut that you will use frequently as you type your code. So with this code actions, we need to generate a constructor that gives our data context some options. So let's press return and let's do that. So this is a constructor in C# code. And when a new instance of this data context is created, then the constructor is executed and any code inside that constructor is also executed. And in this case, it allows us to pass some options to the parent class, the DbContext, and those options will be our database connection string, for example. Something to note though is these ellipses underneath the constructor here. And this tells us that we've got an option to use a primary constructor. Now these ellipses, these are quite handy because these will notify you if there's a cleaner, better way of writing your code, depending on what version of C# you're using. Now .NET 8 comes with C# 12, and one of the features of C# 12 is this concept of a primary constructor. And if we use the code actions, once again, I'll use the keyboard shortcut, then we can say to use the primary constructor. And what this gives us is a much cleaner way of adding constructor code than we had before. And this is exactly the same result of the code we had before, but it's just cleaner. It gives us less boilerplate in our code. So we're still doing the same thing. We've still got a constructor, but this is referred to as a primary constructor instead of having a separate constructor inside the class itself. Now, another thing that we're going to add inside here is we need to tell our DbContext about our entities. And the way that we do that is we add a prop and use the snippet, and this is going to be of type DbSet. And if we take a look at the description here, a DB set can be used to query and save instances of a type of entity. And we use link queries against a DB set, which are then translated into queries against the database. So we write our database code in C# effectively. We don't need to understand or know how to write an actual SQL query, because Entity Framework, because it's an object relational mapper, will translate our C# code into a language that whatever database technology we're using that's supported by Entity Framework can actually understand. So we're going to use a DB set, and then we tell it what type of entity we've created that we want to use for our DB set. Now we only have one, and that is our app user, so we'll use that. And the auto import in C#, like I mentioned, is very good now. So we've got our using API entities at the top there for the app user. And the property name we give this is going to be users. And Entity Framework is convention based. So if we call this users, then this is going to be the name of our table in our database. And if we right click app user and say go to definition, then I just want to describe some other conventions as well. So the ID field, we've called it ID. By convention, Entity Framework will call a property called ID. It will use that as the primary key for the database. If I was to call it something else, I don't know what that is, but if I was to call it anything but ID, then this would not be valid, or Entity Framework would not know which one of these to choose to use as a primary key. If we wanted to call this something other than ID, then we would have to specify an attribute in here of key to tell Entity Framework that this is what we wanted to use as our ID property. But that would be silly, because we've got conventions that means that we do not have to do that, and simply by calling it ID, then this is going to be the primary key in our database. Another convention is that if this is an integer, then Entity Framework will tell our database to use auto-incrementing numbers each time a new record is added to that database. So Entity Framework is convention-based, and I'll point out these conventions as we use them to describe what these conventions are actually going to do for us. So in this case, we're going to get a table called users, and it's going to use the ID property as the primary key of that database. Then we need to tell our application about this DbContext class. And I mentioned earlier that when we add a new service to our application, we need to register it in the program class itself. So if we go to the program.cs, then inside the services section, just below this comment, or below the add controllers, I'm just going to add the service that we're going to register. So we say builder.services, and then we can say add DbContext, and then we specify the name of the DbContext class we have created. And in this case, that's going to be DataContext. And then we pass the options, because when we add a service or register a service in this way, that when we use it, and the way that we're going to use this is via dependency injection. And through dependency injection, then .NET is going to create a new instance of our DataContext class. And via the constructor, it's going to get past the options that we specify here when we register this service. So we give this some options, and I'll specify opt, and then we add effectively an arrow, and on the next line we'll open curly brackets and then specify the options that we're going to pass to our DbContext. Now the options we need here is to tell it what database technology we're using. So in this case we're going to say opt.useSQLite, and then in the arguments for this we need to tell it what options we need for our SQLite database, and this is effectively our connection string. So I'm going to say, as our connection string, we're going to get this from configuration. And the way that we get something from our configuration is we use builder. So I'll specify builder, and then we can access configuration. And then inside here, we have a special configuration setting saying get connection string. And this is shorthand for get section connection strings. That will become important soon. So I'm going to use this, and then I'm just going to specify the name that we'll give our connection string as default connection. Now watch out when we use strings because it's very easy to make typos inside this, and we're not going to get any compiler support to notify us if we've made a mistake with a string. So please be accurate when you do use a string to identify which part of our configuration you want to get something from. So I've gone for a default connection here, which is just a convention for specifying a name of a connection string. But it doesn't have to be that. You can call this anything you want. This is just what I'm going for. So now we've got our configuration in place, we'll take a look at next creating the connection string itself and an entity framework migration.